The AFC North is arguably the best division in the entire NFL, with 4 serious playoff contenders and a couple of championship contenders. Today, let's do our 2024 division preview for the AFC North.
Hi guys, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the AFC North in this video. Like I said, maybe the best division in the NFL. There are so many good teams. Last year, the Baltimore Ravens won this division, but there's a very good chance that somebody beats them. So in today's video, we're going to talk about each individual team for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys a full-on division preview. But before we hop into the video, around 93% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. But let's hop into the video.
So as I mentioned, we're going to start off by doing every single team first. We're going to start off with the Cincinatti Bengals. In my opinion, one of the 2 teams in this division that, in my opinion, are serious championship contenders. Last year, the Cincinnati Bengals had a very disappointing season after they went 9-8 and had a bunch of injuries that completely derailed their season. Despite only going 9-8, however, they still were able to put up more points than the Pittsburgh Steelers, who happened to make the playoffs and actually had a higher net point differential, albeit not by much, but still it was higher than the Pittsburgh Steelers. So that does tell you that despite everything that did go wrong last year, this team was not that far away from making it to the playoffs. And in this offseason, they really focused on a couple of things. Number one, fixing any sort of holes that this team had, primarily positions along the offensive line, some defensive tackle issues, and some positions in the secondary. And they also just maintained the basic roster of this team. For the most part, this is the exact same roster, plus a couple of additions. You obviously still have your main core of guys like Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Joe Burrow. And as I mentioned earlier, you added a couple pieces. Some big name guys they added this offseason were Jermaine Burton, who was a draft pick in this last year's draft. He is likely going to be the wide receiver 3 for this team come week 1. You also brought in Zach Moss to be your Joe Mixon replacement, and I actually kind of think that this low-key could be a better player than Joe Mixon next year. I'm not sure if it's going to be 100% confirmed, but I kind of have a feeling in my gut that Zach Moss is going to be in for a massive breakout-like season. And then you brought in some offensive line help with 2 major additions. Trent Brown obviously is the big name piece that you brought in this offseason. Now, as we sit here today, he is dealing with some injuries, but it does not seem to be any sort of long-term issue, so hopefully he will be able to play come week 1. But hypothetically speaking, if they do want to go down the roster and pick somebody else, you obviously have your first round pick in Amarius Mims, who is waiting to take the reins of that right tackle position. The rest of the offensive line is basically the exact same as last year, so that right tackle spot is really the only noticeable battle that we're going to be seeing this offseason. Then on the defensive side of things, you brought in Sheldon Rankins, who last year had 6 sacks. That does bode well for a defense that likes to get to the quarterback. Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard are a really good defensive end combination, and those are 2 guys who are underrated pass rushers, especially Trey Hendrickson. He's a monster. Then your linebacking core is still as good as it was last year. Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, don't got to talk too much about them. If you watch my underrated video, you guys know I actually did have Logan Wilson in that video. I think he's extremely underrated. And then in your secondary, you added some key players, mainly Geno Stone, who's going to be a big-time playmaker for this defense. The rest of the defense, however, is basically the same. You did lose a couple pieces, but I really did like the Geno Stone addition. I think he's going to be in for a massive season. So all in all, in my opinion, the Cincinnati Bengals did have a really awesome offseason. They basically shored up every single position that they needed to fix, and even though they did lose some players, I still have confidence in this team to be really good next year. For me, this team is a championship-level roster, and I say that with a bit of an asterisk next to it, and that asterisk being that this team has got to stay healthy. Through Joe Burrow's young career, he's had a couple of season-ending injuries. Obviously, last year he had the big one, and honestly was struggling throughout the entire season with injuries. And then obviously his rookie year, but we all know that a healthy Joe Burrow is a top 10, top 5 level quarterback. And so if you are able to have a full season of healthy Joe Burrow, I do fully expect the Cincinnati Bengals team to be really freaking awesome next year. So last year you went 9-8, you missed out on the playoffs, and obviously you got better. So I think that this team has a bright future for them. I think they're going to win somewhere between 10 to 13 games next year. I think the big sort of thing that this team has to do is, number one, stay healthy, but also they have to navigate through a tough conference and a tough division. So it's not like this team is just going to run to an easy 11 or 12 win season. I do think they're going to have to earn it, and I think they're going to have to prove a lot of people wrong, because a lot of people are starting to doubt this Bengals team. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to our second team on today's list, and that's going to be the Cleveland Browns. Now, last year, the Cleveland Browns had a pretty awesome season, finishing the season with an 11-6 record and had a net point differential of positive 34. And in this offseason, they basically ran back the exact same roster, plus a couple of pieces like Jerry Jeudy, but again, like I said, basically the same roster. The big thing that's happening for this Browns team is that they're finally going to be healthy for a full season. Last year, they had injury after injury after injury, and yet they still managed to go 11-6. With that being said, though, I am a little bit concerned as to how these players will perform after the injuries, because obviously last year you had major injuries to guys like Deshaun Watson, Nick Chubb, Jedrick Wills, Jack Conklin, some pieces along the defensive line and within your secondary. So I do think it is at least reasonable for me to say that I am a tad bit worried as to how these guys will come back from those injuries in this upcoming one, but assuming they do come back fully healthy and fully like they usually do play, then I think this team should be in for a big year. Offensively speaking, your receiving core of Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, and Elijah Moore, not to mention Cedric Tillman, is a really solid receiving core, and I'm extremely excited to see what those guys can do alongside Deshaun Watson, who is kind of in for a make or break season. Running back wise, you have a really good set of running backs all the way from your starter to your fourth string. I think this is a really solid running back core. Nick Chubb is sort of the big question mark. How is he going to bounce back from what was an awful injury? And I really do hope he can come back, but I think it's reasonable for me to doubt it at this point. However, behind him, if Nick Chubb is not able to return back to form, you have some really good running backs in guys like Jerome Ford, Deontay Foreman, and Nyheim Hines. I feel confident in really any of these running backs to be the starter next year, so I'm not too worried about that position. Offensive line-wise, it completely depends on the health of the players. If they stay healthy, I have no doubts about this O-line. However, they weren't able to stay healthy last year, so I am a tad bit concerned. Then defensively speaking, as long as you stay healthy, it's pretty similar to the offensive line. I think this is a really good coach defense and a really good defense in general. They have great personnel, great players, just gotta stay healthy. So with that being said, you went 11-6 last year, and I really don't expect this team to take a drastic step back. I just really think this team is going to probably stay the course. For me, the big question mark that does come with this team is what Deshaun Watson we're going to get this upcoming season. I don't think it's an understatement to say that he has kind of been disappointing ever since they traded for him. And it really hasn't been because of the performance on the field. It's been primarily because of the health. But even when he is playing, it's not like he's playing at a top 10 level. So with that being said, I kind of view this as, I don't want to say a make or break year, but like it kind of is the definition of a make or break year. I just don't know what this team is going to do if Deshaun Watson has another lackluster season. At the end of the day, this is a championship level roster, and I do think that you want a guy like Deshaun Watson, who you're paying a ton of money and you traded a lot of assets for, to be the guy who can lead this team to a championship. So with that being said, in terms of how many wins they'll get next year, I predict they'll win somewhere between 10 to 13. I think their floor is probably around 10 wins, and that's assuming that Deshaun Watson is healthy and if Deshaun Watson is playing at a okay level. Whereas if Deshaun Watson is playing at a high level, I think they're a 13-win team. Next up, let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens, a lot of people's favorite team to win this division, and in my opinion, rightfully so. Last year, they went 13-4, made it all the way to the AFC Championship game, and just came up a couple plays short. And in this offseason, they ran back essentially the exact same roster, minus a couple pieces, but added a couple pieces as well. Offensively, I think this team took a big step forward. They brought in Derrick Henry and Lott as if they haven't broke out yet, but another massive season. The offensive line is really solid. Tyler Linderbaum has become one of the best centers in the entire NFL. I think there's a lot of really good weapons around Lamar Jackson. And of course, having Derrick Henry be an ultimate kind of scapegoat is going to be awesome for Lamar. I've seen a lot of people say that Derrick Henry is going to go out there and run for 1,400 rushing yards next year, but in my opinion, there really is no big need for this team to do that. If I was the Baltimore Ravens, I would probably run Derrick Henry somewhere along the lines of like 15 to 20 times a game, and that's about it. I wouldn't really want to put too much more on his legs because I want to save him for the playoffs. Assuming that Lamar does stay healthy the majority of the season, this team will be making the playoffs, so you want to have Derrick Henry prepared for when he needs to make big plays in the playoffs, because this team might rely on him heavily at that time. As it goes for the defense, I think it's fairly reasonable to somewhat assume that this defense will take a slight step back next year, because obviously you lost a lot of key players, obviously the big names like Patrick Queen and Geno Stone. I do think that is a bit of a concern, but I still feel as if this defense is still ultra talented, and as long as you have your mainstay guys like Roquan Smith and Kyle Hamilton, I think you're going to be okay. Obviously, the defensive coordinator left, but you're replacing him with somebody who I think is going to run a very similar system, so I'm not too concerned about the coaching of this defense. Assuming that this defense can play at like a top 10 level, I think this offense should take a big step forward, so I think anything you do lose in the defense, you'll probably pick back up with the offense. I think this team is going to be just as good this year as they were last year. In terms of how many games this Baltimore Ravens team is going to win, it's really hard to assume they're going to win more than 13 games because the rest of the conference and the division have gotten better. So I think worst case scenario, this team does win like 11 games next year, but I think best case scenario, they match either 13 or 14 wins. But lastly, let's go ahead and talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers, the team that a lot of people have been talking about this offseason because of some of the major moves they made. Obviously, the major headlines for this team was the quarterback position and what they were going to do. And they replaced a really lackluster quarterback room with actually kind of an exciting group of guys. You have Russell Wilson and obviously Justin Fields, and I think there is a guy who can play this year and a guy who's going to be the quarterback moving forward. Out is going to make the playoffs, yet they always seem to find a way in the playoffs. And to be honest with you guys, even though I likely won't select this team to make the playoffs this year because of how good the rest of the conference is, I can realistically see a world where this Pittsburgh Steelers team surprises a lot of people and somehow makes it to the playoffs. I think that's a very reasonable thing to say. But as I mentioned, they went 10-7 last year, had a net point differential of -20, and of course would lose in the first round. And in this offseason, they kind of overhauled a lot of different positions, starting off with the quarterback room. Again, Russell Wilson will be starting. I do expect him to play at a pretty high level this year, but I don't think he's better than guys like Joe Burrow, maybe even Deshaun Watson, definitely not Lamar Jackson. But around him, you actually have a very young and exciting group of guys. You of course have Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. Then of course you have George Pickens, who I'm excited to see what he can do as he sort of solidifies himself as that true wide receiver 1 in the league. Next to him, you have Van Jefferson, who is a very solid receiver 3/2, and then Roman Wilson will likely be more of your slot guy. I'm extremely excited to see what he can do in this system. Offensive line wise, I think you have maybe the most exciting tackle duo in the league with guys like Troy Fautanu and Broderick Jones. There is a lot of talent there, and I think those guys will be playing with each other for many, many years to come. Defensively speaking, we obviously know how good this linebacking core is, but then you brought in a really exciting free agent in Patrick Queen. Now, before I talk about Patrick Queen, I think it's very important that we sort of set up what I think about Patrick Queen, because I think that is important for this conversation. Patrick Queen, to me, is like a very solid linebacker 2, but I don't know if he's really a standout linebacker 1. But fortunately for this team, you have a good group of linebackers with guys like Cole Holcomb, Peyton Wilson, and Nick Herbig, if he does ever play linebacker. I think that's a really good group of guys, so I don't think it's that big of a deal that Patrick Queen, to me, is not a true linebacker 1. I've watched him his entire career, and I've never really been that impressed with him until last season. Last season was kind of his big breakout year, and I don't think it's a coincidence that his best year was also the team's best year, at least for the Ravens, with Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. I don't think it's a coincidence that he was playing at his highest level as a true linebacker 2 next to Roquan Smith. With that being said, though, I still feel as if he's a really good player and a really good addition for this defense, and I think he fits in like a glove. So assuming that he's able to play at that exact same level as he's been doing last year, I think this defense is getting a hell of a player. Secondary wise, I don't have a ton of concerns. I wish this team had a better cornerback guy next to Joey Porter Jr., but Dante Jackson, Josiah Scott, I'm at least interested in. So for the most part, you were a really solid team last year, and you're going to be another really good team this year. It's hard to really predict what this team is going to do, and to be honest with you guys, I kind of have a feeling I might get roasted by Steelers fans in the comments. But that's just because, listen guys, the team is great and you got a lot of really good pieces, but I think it's pretty clear and obvious that both the Ravens, Browns, and Bengals are a better roster than the Steelers are today. That's not to say that the Steelers can't compete with these guys, and yes, they will likely beat them a couple times this season, and yes, they likely could make the playoffs, but at the end of the day, this division is just super stacked. And then you got to look outside of the division as well. When you look at the rest of the AFC, you have the likes of the Bills, Dolphins, Jets, Texans, Jaguars, Colts, the Chiefs, and maybe the Raiders could get in there. And I look at all those teams and say they could beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. Not saying that they will beat them, but I'm saying that those guys are really tough matchups for a Steelers team. So I think worst case scenario, you end up with like 8 wins next year and just miss the playoffs. But I think best case scenario, you one up yourself from last year and go 11-6 and have a pretty solid season and probably make the playoffs.
All right, so we talked about each individual team. Let's now do our division preview. As I mentioned, this is a really awesome division. The Pittsburgh Steelers, in my opinion, are the worst team in this division, yet I still think there's a really solid chance that this team does make it into the playoffs. My expectations for this division are extremely high. I think every single one of these teams have a very good chance of making the playoffs, and I think each one of these teams expects themselves to be in the championship competition. I think the best team in this division is going to be the Baltimore Ravens yet again. I know they took a couple steps back defensively, but I think offensively they took a couple steps forward, so I kind of think that cancels out. And as I said in the video, I think they'll win somewhere between 11 to 14 games, which in my opinion puts them as the highest potential team in this division. Below them at number 2, we'll be doing the Cincinatti Bengals. I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between 10 to 13 games. My thought process on the Bengals is quite simple. They're a really awesome team, and if they stay healthy, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase can carry this team into a deep playoff run. At 3 is going to be Cleveland. I think Cleveland is an awesome team construction-wise, but I just have some question marks with the quarterback position. I think the roster by itself, regardless of quarterback play, can lead that team to probably a very good record. But if the quarterback plays well, that's an extra bonus for this team that can maybe push them to be a championship contender. And then for Pittsburgh, I do have some concerns about a couple position groups in this team, but I still think the overall roster is very, very solid. If Russell Wilson can perform just as well as he did last year, or maybe a tad bit better, this is a playoff team and a really good team at that. With that being said, I look around the rest of the NFL and I don't think there's a division that stacks up quite as well as this division. The NFC North, in my opinion, is maybe their toughest competition, but even with that division, I don't think there's 4 teams that can make the playoffs. Whereas with this division, I think there's realistically 4 teams that can win over 10 games and can all make the playoffs. It's a stacked division, and it's a lot of fun to talk about. But if you agree or disagree with the opinions in my video, let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.